Thank you, James. We've got James Taylor, James DeMint, James Inhofe, several other. I think the increase in James is a greater threat than the increase in the temperatures on Earth right now. But thank you. Thanks for doing this every year. It really backs up a lot of folks who are in public office who are constantly under the threat of intimidation. You know, I find it very convenient that the politicians who would seize power from people and heavily regulate businesses on the threat of ill-defined climate catastrophe are usually the ones who wanted to control everything anyway. It's funny how that works out, and it's clear what the goals are. It really is central power. I was in London a couple of weeks ago talking to the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists, and they were talking about centralized power and what it was doing to them, what it was doing to hurt the freedom there. Of course, the folks who talked about climate change and centralized power have been running into problems, as has already been mentioned this morning. Global warming had to become climate change, which became a warming hiatus, and I'm sure in the next few months we'll hear of some other term that accommodates the lack of facts in their thesis. It's really more of a hiatus from reason, as all of you know. Some talking heads are even calling for penalties and censorship against those who refuse to parrot their ideology, which reveals their contempt for scientific inquiry and open debate. Those assembled here today, however, do not ascribe to an ideology when it comes to facts. And the facts are these. Climate always changes. Human activity might play a role. And as James just talked about, that's not necessarily a problem, especially not one to be solved by policies which could impoverish prosperous societies and destroy poor ones, and not improving the environment. Contorting models and predictions to lie about this so that one can advance a centralized political agenda is not simply an insult to science, it's an offense against democracy. Therefore, it's vitally important that we recognize leaders and public figures who have stood against the tide, unwilling to preach falsehoods to push an agenda of power, willing to stand up against the really incredible intimidation that goes on for those who speak the truth. One such leader is my friend Senator Jim Inhofe. For nearly 3 decades, he has represented the people in the state of Oklahoma in the House and the Senate. He's an avid pilot. He's traveled extensively around the world, working with people in governments around the world. I've seen him insulted and treated poorly for speaking the truth for years. Even in the Republican conference, when he would try to get attention to the real facts, he often stood against incredible odds. With his responsibility as chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Inhofe has cast a watchful eye upon those who would deprive Americans of their liberty and prosperity. He has been an outspoken opponent against economic measures which would be disastrous to all Americans, that would do nothing to improve our environment. He has championed an ethic of rational conversation and conservatism, that we must preserve our environment for the sake of people, not hurt them by entertaining ill-conceived doomsday prophecies which are neither honest or scientific. Today we thank him for holding the line until sanity returns to science, until our government once again returns to reason. I'm honored on behalf of the Heritage Foundation and the Heartland Institute to present Senator Inhofe with the 2015 Political Leadership on Climate Change Award. Jim, would you step up?
Wow. Well, it's good to be back with Jim DeMint. And I would remind some of you who may not be aware of it, the last year he served in the United States Senate, he and I were number 1 and 2 most conservative members of the United States Senate. So I lost my partner there, Jim, but you're still around doing big things. And let me tell you, are we using our thing here? There we go. All right. The reason I'm putting these things up, I'm going to make reference to them. And at your place, you found a handout. I want to ask you, please don't throw it away. And you'll understand in a minute why it's important. And you don't have to take notes. I'm not here to entertain you. I would love to do that, but you're too important to be entertained. You are the ones out in the field with the courage to stand up for what we all believe is right. And to do that, you've got to be armed with information, since you're going to be the ones on the line talking to people. So you'll find out in a minute why you have that handout. Let me just say this. We have used you folks before. That particular one, that was a speech I gave on the floor having to do with the Keystone XL pipeline. Got the whole information, all that from you guys. So it's not just global warming. You guys are on the right side of the Lord in all these things. And, you know, it's kind of fun that we now have a Republican majority. And that means on the committee of jurisdiction for all of these, yeah, I agree. But the jurisdiction for all of the overregulation of the EPA and what they're doing, I have to tell you one story. It's called my political justice story. I went, before I was in Washington, I had a whole career. I was a builder and developer. And I was out there and I was doing things that Americans are supposed to be doing. I was making fortunes, losing fortunes. I was expanding the tax base, doing what Americans are supposed to be doing. And yet, the chief opposition I had all that time, Jim DeMint, was the federal government, and primarily the EPA. I mean, the last project I did in anyone here from Texas? Yeah, it was down in South Texas. I built a 48-unit thing. I had to go to 26 governmental agencies to get a dock permit. So I thought, you know, who's on my side? Now, fast forward, now I am the chairman of the committee that has the jurisdiction over the very bureaucracy that tried to put me out of business for 20 years. There we go. That's poetic justice. So anyway, that's what we're doing. And confession is good for the soul. Let me just share with you, and I will stay within the time limit that you have given me. But I think I have to confess that way back in the 90s, and I remember this, and Mark Morano, who's in the audience here today, will remember this also. Back at that time, I assumed everyone said the world's coming to an end, it's global warming. I thought it's probably true. Until the MIT and the Charles Rivers and Associates came out with, if we were to pass what they want to do, and they suggested down in Rio de Janeiro with Al Gore, the cost to the American people would be, the range would be between $300 and $400 billion a year. I did my calculation in my state of Oklahoma, as I always do, and that would mean that each person, each family of 4 in my state of Oklahoma who filed a federal income tax return would have to pay $3,000. And I thought, you know, let me make sure the science is there. So I started checking and I started questioning it. Then the phone calls started coming in from scientists all over, and we started publishing this to show that it was, in fact, was not. It was not a reality. So what I want to do is kind of go over a little bit of the background and where we are today, because it has changed from where it was before. First of all, as you know, Senator Whitehouse has now made his 100th speech on global warming on the Senate floor. And I don't want to really pick on him, because while this is all contrived with Tom Steyer putting $100 million in to defeat Republicans who would not stand the line on global warming, in fairness to Whitehouse, he wasn't up for re-election. But he was kind of the front man for those individuals to get them involved. And so what they had to do at that time was, we had Tom Steyer. We all know about this. He's proud of it, as a matter of fact. I've given his speeches on the floor. I show his great big picture, and he's very proud to be the one who is going to resurrect global warming. And so he started doing that and having all-night sessions. Now, I was the only Republican that went down for the first all-night session, and I said, now, just in case, there's anyone at home who has insomnia. you've come to the right place, because you're going to hear all night long the same arguments used over and over and over again, arguments that have been refuted many times, and you're not going to be able to last very long. And besides that, it's all about money. And at that time, I talked about Tom Steyer, and one of my fellow senators stood up and he said, "Are you saying that we're paid to do this?" And I said, "No, I'm not saying that. Tom Steyer is saying that." So that's what we had. So there we were, and again, I thank all of you for the support that you have been in this cause. When I say it's about money, Mother Nature does have a sense of humor. If you look at this up here, remember that was on the cover of National Review, and that was one that came out in New York. They said that we have evidence that shows that Al Gore may well be the first environmental billionaire in the United States. And sure enough, there he is. And at the time he was trying to have all these events, what was happening? There was his global warming cruise across the Northwest Passage to talk about global warming. But guess what? It got so cold up there that they closed the passage. So he wasn't able to. In February of 2007, he was at a House hearing on warming that was canceled because of the ice storm. In March of 2009, Pelosi was snowed out of a global warming rally. And even though environmental activists and other climate change entrepreneurs were like Tom Steyer, the candidates, it was a losing effort. And we know the results. Now, as of yesterday, now this is something you don't know. This is brand new stuff, and I hope I can find my documentation here. As of yesterday, there is another Tom Steyer who's surfaced. His name is Jay Faison, Faison. And it's not that he's going to put $100 million in to try to resurrect the myth of global warming. He's putting $175 million in, and he's going to concentrate on Republicans. And so if you add that together with Tom Steyer's, we're looking at the next, and you need to understand this, at the next election, that they are going to try, that's $250 million that's going to go in from those two sources to try to, I say resurrect, in a minute I'll say why I use the word resurrect, because they've been losing this battle. And I can't find that paper I was going to have on his. Anyway, he's not pure. Oh, here it is right here. This is the guy that I just talked about, Tom Faison, or however you pronounce it. In sum, this Republican, he's a Republican, so he's going to go after Republican senators, is claiming to be a philanthropist. He really stands to gain a lot from climate change due to his own solar investments. So keep that in mind, you guys. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars here, and there's a reason for it. Now, the next slide there I want to show, because you remember that, you guys? This is kind of neat. It's the first time in the history of the United States Senate that a senator has thrown a snowball at the presiding officer. But there it is, right? Oh, there it is. I'll tell you what's funny about that. You guys watch TV and you see these kids that are there that are pages. And so I went down there and I said, I'm going to do something. I'm going to ask all you pages, who's the best athlete of all of you? And they all pointed to a guy named Chris Ferrari. Well, by coincidence, he was a page from Oklahoma. And I said, all right, I'm going to throw this up there. I'm going to throw it a little bit low. So anyone here from Alaska? Dan Sullivan, a great new attraction. Anyway, he was presiding at that time. And I threw it a little low. It went off just like clockwork. He ran up and caught it. Anyway, you can't take these things too seriously. You got to have fun in life. And so anyway, we did. What I want to do, if you'll take your sheet here, I'd like to remind you that all of the arguments that you're hearing are arguments that have been there before and they've been refuted. There's a book you ought to read if you want to know how important you are. It's called American Political Patterns by Dan Nemo. If you read this book, he'll draw you to the conclusion that the decisions of this country are made by less than 0.5% of the people. Now, when you do your own math on that, that means I don't see 400 people here today. Each one of you is an army of 200. I see 80,000 people here today. And that's the reason I'm arming you, because you're going to be confronted with people who are out there, the alarmists, who are still a slight majority. Well, not quite a slight majority anymore. But nonetheless, if you'll take the arguments that they use, these are old arguments that have been refuted over and over again. The first one, the fact-reviewed, peer-reviewed paper, they talk about the Antarctic and the peninsula is shrinking. and that, in fact, the American Geophysical Union found a doubling in snow accumulations. Yeah, I know you've heard this stuff before. Now you've got it all down. Polar bears. You know, there is a problem with polar bears right now. It's overpopulation. If you look at this, they alarm us that polar bears are disappearing. Well, that's not quite true, because in the 60s, the number of Canadian polar bears was between 5,000 and 10,000. Today, they're between 15,000 and 25,000. So it has actually tripled. Now, those are just two examples. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but if you would do that, you'll have an answer for every assertion anyone comes to you with. And when you see these people that are out there campaigning for office, whether it's running for president or anything else, you'll find that those individuals are using these same arguments, and now you have an answer to every argument that they'll use, okay? Now, I want to real quickly move to something that is happening that you may not be totally aware of. You know, they've lost the battle in terms of getting regulations through or getting legislation passed. When Jim DeMint was serving with me in the Senate, at that time they still had hope that they're going to be able to pass legislation for cap and trade. And so if you look historically at what happened, go all the way back to 1997, we passed something called the Byrd-Hagel, wasn't that it? Byrd-Hagel, which said we know that Al Gore is going down to Rio de Janeiro, wherever that is down there, and he's going to come back with a treaty. He's going to want us to ratify the treaty. And so we passed something 95-0 that says if he brings back a treaty that either is harmful economically to America or has us do something that China is not going to have to do, we will reject it. That was 95-0. Then 2002 came, and we had the McCain-Lieberman bill. You all remember that. And of course, McCain was a Republican, so it wasn't all that partisan. I don't know what Lieberman was at that time. He might have been an independent, Jim. But anyway, they had that bill, and we defeated it. I remember it down on the floor trying to get other members down there. They were willing to vote against it because they didn't want to incur the largest tax increase in the history of America, but they didn't want to go down and talk about it. So anyway, we won that one. They came back 2 years later, the McCain-Lieberman bill. We defeated that one. And several of them, these were all Senate bills up until the Markey-Waxman bill. And the same argument, each time we ended up with a larger group opposing it. So we have a president who came into office and said, all right, if we're not going to be able to do it through legislation, we do it through regulation. Now, this is something that is illegal in the estimate of most people when he talks about doing this through regulation. And let's stop and think about this. This is one thing that I know that it's kind of in the weeds, but it's important for you to understand this. I had said that everyone agrees, no one disagrees with the fact that if we have cap and trade passed through legislation, it would be between $300 and $400 billion each year. But what that is using as a benchmark, those emitters that emit 25,000 tons of CO2 from one source. Now, if you do it through regulation, they're using the Clean Air Act, and that means those are 250 tons. And so you can't even calculate how much that would cost. And that's what they're in the middle of trying to do at this time. And you're going to find that I'm very proud of the Republican candidates. You know, I belong to the most exclusive club in the world. It's called United States Senators Who Are Not Running for President. Now, these guys, so with... But if you look at the Republican candidates, they're all denying this stuff, so they haven't fallen in, with the exception of Lindsey Graham, they're all with people in this room. So I would keep that in mind as you watch this take place. Now, this should have all ended. Let's see, we're past that one now. Yeah, there we go. This should have all ended when Climategate came. I remember, you know, the big party that the United Nations has every year, every December. It's a huge party, and I can remember going to Milan, Italy. This is one of the first ones many years ago. At that time, I was the only one talking about this issue, and so they had wanted posters on all the telephone poles in Milan with my picture saying "wanted." And so when the thing was over, I went to the source of that, and I said, can I have all of your leftover posters? And I used them for fundraisers when he got back to the United States. So, no, but you see, when we were going to go to Copenhagen, remember Copenhagen? Copenhagen's where they sent everybody out there. I mean, we had all of the all of them went there in advance and said, we're going to pass something in the United States of America, and you're going to be very pleased. We're going to lead the way. We're going to do something with the emissions. And so right before after all these people came back from Copenhagen, I went over to be a one-man truth squad. And I always remember, I do all the way to Copenhagen, spent 3 hours there, and turned around and came back. And I talked to all 191 other countries and told them, I know that you've been told by then Senator Obama, you've been told by Hillary, you've been told about by Barbara Boxer, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, and all the rest of them, that we're going to pass something here that's going to be on emissions of CO2. You've been lied to, and it's not going to happen. And those all 191 people had one thing in common. They all hated me. But we came back, and sure enough, that's what happened. Now we have the next one coming up in Paris, and they're saying right now, this is going to be the one. We're going to adopt a treaty, another treaty, and we're going to make this happen. So what I'd like to do is just share it with you. When Climategate came up, at that time, Lisa Jackson, who remembers Lisa Jackson? She was the first. I really liked her. I was the only Republican who liked her because she had a hard time telling a lie, and she didn't last very long in this administration. But I mean, they have Gina McCarthy now, and she didn't have a problem. But you know, this is with Lisa Jackson. I remember right before I left for Copenhagen, I said, you know, I have a feeling you guys, you're not going to get any legislation passed, so you're going to have to do it through regulation. If you do it through regulation, you have to have what? An endangerment finding. An endangerment finding has to be based on science. So I want to ask you, what science are you going to use? And she said, well, the IPCC. Keep in mind now, when we say IPCC, we're saying the United Nations. So she was going to use that. Now, it couldn't have been more beautiful, the timing on this thing, because it's a matter of days after that Climategate came up. Now, I'd like to, again, have you pick up your sheet here, because you need to have this with you to show the people how bad it was. Here's a guy, the number one person, Phil Jones, who is putting this thing together, and he's the one who said, quote, this is 1999, I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding the real temperatures to each state for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards, and from admitting that they rigged this thing. And then this Keith Trenberth, he was with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. 10 years later, he said, the fact is that we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. Now, that's when they had started juggling the figures, and it was so serious. We didn't hear a lot about this in the United States. We have a lot of foreign press here. They know exactly what I'm talking about. They said, for example, the UK Telegram, it's the worst scientific scandal of our generation. The Financial Times, the closed-mindedness is the stink of intellectual corruption, and on, and throughout the world, people realize that the science on which this greatest tax increase in the history of America would take place was all based on contrived science. So that was it, and if you'll just keep that in mind so that you'll have that handy when it becomes important for you to use. And here's the other one. The next slide is going to be Gina McCarthy. And so she's going to put together this thing, that the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is going to be challenged in court. Everybody knows that. But she's going to put this thing together. And the reason I think this is important for us to look at is this is a huge thing. If you look at the plan, there are 32 states right now that oppose the Clean Power Plan. And 15 have already sued the EPA. 2 states, including my state of Oklahoma, have formally announced their intent just to say no, because what they're trying to do is illegal, and despite this, the president is choosing to ignore the will of Congress. Turn to the next one there. Those are the states, those are the states that oppose it. So in the next slide here, we have you and others showing up. All of a sudden, even the unfriendly press is realizing they've been lied to, and they realize what is going on. And it was the New York Times just recently, they had an article about how the Obama EPA is using the bureaucracy to lobby. And a good bill example, the one they were talking about, is the WOTUS bill. You guys are a rare audience because you know what I'm talking about. The WOTUS bill, if you remember back initially, the states had the jurisdiction over water in the United States, except navigable water. I understand that. I think that should be the federal government. That's fine. But then they in order to get all of that power, and it's now considered to be number one concern of farmers throughout America, In order to get that power, they introduced legislation, Feingold in Wisconsin and Oberstar in Minnesota, to take the word navigable out. Do you follow that? You know, that way the states would be out of the picture. It would be the federal government crawling all over America, making determinations of wetlands and all this. Well, not only did we defeat the bill that they had, but we defeated both Feingold and Oberstar in the next election. So, so anyway, in the next slide, and this is something that is significant. I think James Taylor mentioned this in his pre-introduction when he talked about the hiatus that's taking place. We've had this leveling for a long period of time. Now, what I've used on the Senate floor many times, I don't have to have notes for this because I've used it, is that if you look, you'll see that God's still up there, and we're going to have these cycles, and they have always been there. And let me just give you an example. In 1895, that was when they had the first ice age. They used the word ice age. We're all going to die, and it's an ice age. Then in 1918, about 30 years later, keep in mind now, these are cycles, they came out and they said, well, we have a problem now. We're going to have, that's when they first started using global warming. Then in 1945, it started turning cold again, and we went into a 35-year cycle of being cold. Here's the interesting thing. 1945 happens to be the year, and no one will refute this, that we had the largest surge of CO2 emissions right after the war in 1945, and that precipitated not a global warming, but a cold spell. Then, of course, in 1975, we're still in that cycle area. Well, they were talking about how this is, global warming's coming, and they were projecting that red line. That's what's going to happen. Well, guess what happened? It didn't happen. And so we now have that, and people realize that it, and even the IPCC recognizes. They said, they admitted, and you have to listen to the kind of language they use. It says, quote, almost all historical simulations do not reproduce the observed recent warming hiatus. Combinations of internal climate variability, missing in correct radiative forcing, and model response error. Now, what that means is it's not warming. And so this is in hysteria sin it. If it's not warming, what are we going to do? It's not warming. So anyway, that was one more indicator. By the way, I know that Jim knows this, and most of you probably do, but unless you've been in an elected position, you might not know it. If you don't have the truth on your side, and you don't have logic on your side, you do two things. You insult and you call names. And I would, I think I have this also in the, in some of the things that well, I guess it's not on there. But anyway, yeah, we went through this thing. I know Robert Kennedy called me a prostitute, and he also said this is treason, and we need to start treating them as traitors. Echo magazine Gris called for a Nuremberg-style punishment for people like me. And Barron, the warmest, he said, calls for capital punishment for global warming deniers. And so this is what's going on, and that's always an indication you're winning when they start that. It really is. You can't let it bother you. Now, the next slide, to show that we are winning. I can remember, and you can remember, back, you guys were in the very beginning with us on this thing. You remember when all the polls that came out said that we were going to, it's the number one concern. It was always ranked number one or number two concern of the American people. Well, guess what? Now it's dead last. And you have this, because I want you to carry this with you. Read this. The print's kind of small. But when people, they don't believe it, that people are not concerned about it. And this is why you're seeing the Tom Steyers and the other guy coming along with all of their money. But I think it's very important that you that you be aware that we are winning this thing. And it wasn't long ago when George Mason University did a survey of all of the TV meteorologists, and only 63% of the meteorologists came out and said that if there is global warming, it's due to natural causes, not human causes. So, you got to realize that we are winning. And then next to the last, I do want to talk about a little bit about motives. The UN if you read my book, the last chapter of the book called The Greatest Hoax, it was put together by the research was done by Luke Holland, and it shows how the United Nations is the reason that all of this came along. We all know that this has been, that's why they have their meetings, and the United Nations behind. There are several senators, and Jim was one of those senators when he was serving, that every time the United Nations did something that was not in the best interest of the United States of America, we would send a letter up there and would say that we're going to withhold so much of our funds, our contributions. And this just infuriates the United Nations. They want independence. They don't want to be accountable to anybody, to the United States or any other country. So how do you do that? You have your own funding source. What's the best way to do that? Global warming. And so if you go that and realize that that's really what is going on, and I would say that there are three motives. One is to stop the accountability to United States and anybody else. The second thing is to look at the real cause for it. Now, I was not a fan of Jacques Chirac when he was president of France, but he said that that global warming is the first component of authentic global governance. And I think we heard the same thing from Margot Wallstrom. I think that's on my sheet here. Yeah, you need to have this too. What's it really about? Kyoto is about the economy, about leveling the playing field for big business worldwide. That was Margot Wallstrom, who was EU minister at that time. So, and the last thing that is the motive is power. And I don't think there's any better evidence of that. Richard Lindzen, and you've all heard of him. He arguably might be the most noted, the most scientifically pure individual that's been studying this issue. And he said, and I think you have to stop and think about it, controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. And so that's what this is all about. That's where we are today. And this is where you guys come in. You guys come in now because you're the only organization. Look at the numbers that are in here. And you're all activists, and I really mean that. You're 80,000 people right here in front of me, and you're the ones who have to be armed with the truth. You've got the 4 areas of truth that you need to carry with you because you're going to be confronted. You need to respond to things that people say, and you can do it. And my concern is this. They have on their side money, we've already talked about it, and the bureaucracy. See if you can put that slide. This is the last minute. Okay, leave it up there. I'm almost through. Those are my 20 kids. Kay and I have been married 55 years. We have 20 kids and grandkids. And the one on this far side, the far left of that, is Maggie. She graduated from college this year. And I remember when she was in the 6th grade, and she came home. Now, my name is Inhofe. It starts with an I, so my grandkids say Mamai and Popeye, okay? She came home, and she said, Popeye, why is it you don't understand global warming? And I said, well, Maggie, explain to me, where did you hear this? And she showed me her textbooks. Now, through our bureaucracy, through the EPA, and this is something we're right now tracing down to we can keep the federal government, specifically Obama's EPA, from brainwashing my kids and my grandkids. And she really believed that. So, yeah, they do have that. And my concern is this. I really there are a lot of good people that I disagree with in the United States Senate. They are good people, but they're human beings too. And when they see how much money is there, and they see that the bureaucracy is on the other side, it might be they'll be tempted to maybe give them a vote. And this is what this is all about. This is why you have this last guy with $175 million claiming to be a Republican, and he's going to be using that to try to influence. And all it takes is 1 or 2 or 3 of the senators who say, maybe I should appease them. An appeaser is someone who feeds his friends to the alligators, hoping to eat him last. Hiram man said, no man survives when freedom fails. The best men rot in filthy jails, and those who cried, appease, appease, are hanged by those they tried to please. So I would say, I want you folks, you are equipped, you're ready to do it, and we've got a country we've got to save, and we've got to do it together. If you join us and we do this as a team, you'll be doing the Lord's work, and he will richly bless you for it. Amen.